Welcome to the Clinical Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum Journal Club. Here in our PCRF Journal Club, we promote evidence-based practices by critically evaluating the latest science in emergency medical services. We hope our discussion will help advance EMS practice. Through the generous support of our sponsors, Limmer Education and ESO, we are able to make science more accessible and understandable.
All right, welcome everyone to the August 2025 edition of the Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum Journal Club. Special thank you once again to our sponsors, Limmer Education and ESO, for making it possible for us to be here together today. I'm Remley Crow, and today I am joined by a fabulous panel, Dr. Tony Fernandez, Jeff Rollman, Michael Caduce, Dave Page, and Dr. Bill Toon. And we are also very fortunate to have with us from the authorship team, Medical Director of the Year, probably of the universe, and my sometimes doppelganger, Dr. Maya Dorset. Welcome, Maya.
Thank you very much. I'm really excited to be here.
And for those of you who are just tuning in, as a reminder, the name of the article that we are reviewing is Timeline for Repeat EMS Encounters Resulting in Transport Following Lift Assist in a Suburban EMS System. And this is hot off the press in pre-hospital emergency care. As always, this article will be paired with a discussion written by our very own columnist, Michael Caduce. This will be an EMS World. It's in a section called Journal Watch, so I encourage all of you to check out the article that will come out after this podcast. It'll be at emsworld.com under the category of education and training. And since this is the live version of the podcast, I want to remind those in the audience right now as we begin, you can use your chat feature, type in questions, comments as we go, and we will bring those into the conversation. So without further ado, let's dive in. But first, before we get to the paper at hand, I always like to have the author introduce themselves, and I'd like to hear a little bit about who you are, what you do, and what made you get into EMS research.
So my name's Maya Dorset. I think the most relevant hat I wear relative to this particular episode is I am an Associate EMS Regional Medical Director for a region in upstate New York. It's closer to Canada than it is to New York City, called the Monroe-Livingston region. That includes the city of Rochester. I got into, I would say, I got into research because I was initially in basic science research. My PhD is in genetics, a very unrelated specialty. But the reason I continue to do research in EMS is I have a lot of questions that I want answered to help me take care of patients. And sometimes if nobody's taking on the question, you got to use the data that you have to answer it yourself.
I love that. That's similar to, I'm a do-it-yourself kind of person too, and I like to take on the challenges with data, which there were plenty in this article, and I can't wait until we get to the methods to talk a little bit about what some of those logistical challenges might have been for you. But before we go into methodology, I like to lay the groundwork a little bit. And for those who are watching the video version of this podcast, you'll notice I did giant air quotes on lift assist, which are in the title too. But I want to hear a little bit about what made you particularly interested in asking and answering research questions around lift assist and repeat EMS encounters? Was there perhaps a specific case or a trend that you saw in your own system, or was there something else that drove you to take this on?
The background to this is really as I got into working on, again, the quotes of the lift assist, which we'll talk about why I think that's a diagnosis and a terminology that has a lot of harm, particularly as a dispatch code in our system. I got into that because I was interested in quality improvement. And one of the big tenets of quality improvement is that you should work on the big rocks in your system, the things that are staring in your face that are real quality issues. Around the time I did my EMS fellowship, there was a bunch of publications from David Cohn and Lauren Leggett that looked and sort of challenged, we have this thing that we call the lift assist in EMS, but maybe these patients are not about just being picked up off the floor, that if we look at their 14-day outcomes or their 30-day outcomes, they have high rates of hospitalization. There's like a 2% chance of death within 14 days of one of these index encounters. And when I got into the field, I saw that a lot of these patients not because EMS clinicians weren't trying to take good care of patients, but because there was a system design that dispatched them that said, your job is to pick this person up off the floor, that were getting inadequately assessed. But these are patients that we take care of really every single day in EMS. This is an incredibly vulnerable population that we take care of. And so I started doing quality improvement work around how do we better assess geriatric fall patients in the community, because uh, an older adult who falls in their home is really one of the more complex medical presentations that we see. There's a complexity and why they ended up on the floor, and there's sort of a complexity on sort of decision making around transport. And then on top of it, for patients who are not transported, if we think about, a diagnostic process, it really ends with the EMS clinician, right? If that patient's not transported, because there's nobody else evaluating that patient. But one of the barriers that came up as I was trying to do work around saying, are we doing a good job or are we not doing a good job, was that there weren't national quality measures about what does good look like for this population. And there wasn't a lot of guidance about what should I be measuring. Since then, NEMSQA has come up with some measures like, did you do vital signs in the patients that you didn't transport? But things like ambulation assessment, but also trying to get a little bit more at the outcome measures of specifically, and I think we'll get into the conversation around diagnostic error, the patients who were misdiagnosed that their problem was a gravity problem, like I'm there to pick them up off the floor, when actually their diagnosis is sepsis or congestive heart failure or stroke or some other medical etiology to let them on the floor. And so we had things that we were tracking in our system, but I wanted a question of saying, like, when I'm, for example, looking at repeat transports in the system, what time interval should I be looking at for a quality measure in my system that's going to give me some insight or perspective, or are we missing things in this patient population? So that was the specific, like, what's that timeline? What's that repeat patient time window that I should be looking at? And because of the quality improvement work that we do in our region, we had some data sets that would help us answer that question.
And I love this project for a number of reasons, but it is a big rock for a lot of EMS systems that we don't focus as much time and energy and research on. And so this is a true baseline for a lot of systems to be able to look at and say, how am I aligning or how am I not aligning? And the statistician in me particularly loves having a baseline on, at any given point, somebody is going to have a certain type of event. Like somebody will have a cardiac arrest today, but having the baseline on what incidents of cardiac arrest should be concerning is a very powerful tool from which we can design other system interventions. So I want to give big kudos to this authorship team. I know it takes a team to get this work through, and it was no easy lift. I am going to invite Dr. Tony Fernandez to the conversation because I'd like to dig in a little bit to, you have this excellent question, but how do we go about getting the data together to answer it in a way that's reliable? And so, Tony, I'm going to turn it over to you to dig a little bit into the study design and the setting and some of those methods.
Well, thank you, Dr. Crow, and thank you, Dr. Dorsett, for joining us today. I'm really excited to discuss your project here. This is going to be this is a lot of fun. So can you tell us a little bit about, actually, let's just start with your study objective. What did you seek to do in this study?
So the primary objective, right, there was a few other questions that we looked at, but the primary objective of the study was really to identify the timeline of when do these repeat encounters happen following this index call of a lift assist diagnosis, to say, when are those things happening so that I can start designing quality measures around that time window of repeat patients. There were secondary things that we looked at, like could we, were there findings on that first visit that could predict whether or not the patient was transported in the second visit? But those weren't the primary objectives because we recognized very early on our data set is small to answer those kinds of questions. But the timeline question is one that we could answer with the data that we had.
Excellent. And so definitions are important, and that's something that we go over a lot here on our podcast. And one of the things, there are a couple of ways, obviously, that you can find lift assist or identify lift assist in an electronic health record. Can you tell us what was your definition for your study?
So we had And I think this is such a key point. Actually, Lawrence Brown, several years ago, wrote this really great uh, like editorial within PEC called like something like Lift Assist Nebulous Complexity for Research, because there is no lift assist within Nemesis. That's not one of the primary impressions. It's not an ICD-10 code. There is a disposition of public assist, but that is not specifically talking about this population of patients, which really, if you think about who are we trying to get at, we're trying to identify those patients who are older, who probably presented as a fall or a gravitational challenge of some kind, and were not transported to the hospital. Within our system, the way that we did this is that we actually have all the agencies that were part of this research study all use the same electronic documentation platform, which is on a regional command. So their standardization at the regional level, they use EMS charts, where what the provider sees, the clinician sees when they complete the chart is that they can actually enter a primary impression of a lift assist that on the back end maps to the NEMSIS code of like a general medical examination, like no problem found. So that we were using a primary impression entered by a clinician that this is lift assist only. And that was important for us because what we were trying to get at were patients who actually had this as a diagnosis. And I feel really strong like this is diagnosis, it's not a dispatch code. When I say somebody is a lift assist only, I've made the diagnosis that I went, the patient was on the ground. The problem was that they were on the ground and nothing else was wrong, right? Like they weren't sick and ended up on the ground. They didn't pass out and go on the ground. They didn't have a stroke and went on the ground, but nothing else is wrong. And the one thing that they needed was me to pick them up and get them to the recliner or the bed or fix that gravitational challenge. So we were using clinician diagnosis. There's other ways to do this, right? Like if you were looking at a larger data set, you, for example, could look at a dispatch of a low acuity fall with a in a certain age with a disposition of non-transport. But that's not the way that we did it because we had the option to actually specifically look at this as a diagnosis. And in our system, that's the way that we pull charts for quality review. Prior work that had worked on lift assist did something similar to us because, like, for example, in Cohn's study, when they were actually using, when they cleared, EMS cleared the scene, they would call it lift assist only, like on the dispatch, so that they would say this was just a lift assist only. So they were using this like diagnostic idea. But that was one thing that we had using this local data set where we had sort of control of the impressions that people see locally. But it's not like I can pull a NEMSIS code for this and do a national thing. You have to be really thoughtful about, am I capturing the right population?
Yeah, absolutely. I love how you call this a gravitational challenge. That's that's a really unique way to term this. And I think that's really important for you to point out, and thank you for the going into that in such detail about how this may be challenging if you wanted to replicate this on the NEMSIS standard data set or their research data set or other large data sets. This is something that you were able to do locally that mapping and transforming data may make more challenging. So you did start to tell us a little bit about the system and that you're in upstate New York. Can you kind of dive a little deeper and tell us about your EMS system, kind of where your folks work, and kind of a little bit about the population you serve?
So Monroe Livingston has a number of ALS agencies, but the only ones included within our region were the ones that were on this particular documentation platform, because we have 3 to 4 documentation platforms within our region, and we needed consistency and the ability to specifically pull, as well as the ability to do this repeat patients report, which we had the ability to do within that system, and we've been tracking. For the agencies that were included, this included 12 different ALS agencies of various different sizes. So anywhere between 3,000 calls a year and, like 20 to 30,000 calls per year. It included BLSFRs and BLS transport agencies. There was 5 only like BLS transport agencies. So we were able to use like regional level data to look at this. The reason we called the suburban EMS system is that notably one of the key components that was not included, because they're on a different documentation platform, was the EMS agency provider for the city of Rochester. which is like the urban component. And so this is predominantly suburban with like a little touch of like a little bit of rural, but that was very low call volume.
Yeah, and thanks for that. I think that's really important to help our audience kind of contextualize the results and see how they may stack up to what they may see in their own systems. So you did talk about how your goal was to look at follow-up and to see when these patients were activated EMS again. And you chose a 7-day follow-up window. And I think that's unique and a really important decision here. Can you tell us why you went with something like 7 days as opposed to, you see other studies that look at follow-up and they're looking at 14 days or a month or something like that. How did you come up with your 7-day follow-up window?
Specifically, I wanted that others had looked at 14 days, but the goal of what I really wanted to look at is a diagnostic error. So this idea that there's a diagnosis that we missed on the first encounter, and then the second encounter is related to that first encounter. Previously, and I can't say that using this particular data, but I wanted to like narrow this time window so that I was more likely to be looking at that. Previous work on this particular population was looking at 14 days and 30 days. This is an extremely comorbid population. It's one of the complexities of looking at this. I cannot, when Remley's like, yeah, there's a particular incidence, like some people just die in your community. Older patients who are right, who have a lot of frailty and comorbidities are just at a higher probability of having those things or requiring transport to the hospital. So that's one of the complexities, specifically also with looking at retrospective data like this in this population. But I'm like interested in saying, is there something intervenable? Like, is there something thinking about in the future where we can say, if we do interventions to better assess these patients or do better shared decision making around transport, can we identify, for example, like sepsis earlier? And the background for this is that this study was done when I already since 2021-22 have been doing quality improvement work around improving our assessment of these non-transport geriatric fall patients in the community. And while this paper did not include outcome data, because these patients are transported to multiple health systems, and I only have about 60% follow-up, I knew from looking at our data for these patients that I follow up that for the patients who were transported to the hospital, less than half of them were going home, 9% were dying, and that the most common diagnoses that we were seeing were sepsis and congestive heart failure. Very few traumatic injuries are missed. We're pretty good at catching when somebody's broken their hip, but we weren't catching like subtle presentations of illness. But I do know those things are not you don't do better by having a delay in your sepsis treatment. Like the sooner you're treated. So I was really focused on saying when we were looking at these repeat patients, like, can we get data that says, like, yeah, for the most part, if I look at the system, what's that timeline? And looking at this tight timeline to say, like, is it potentially something that we missed on that first? Because that's the gap, right? That's the opportunity for improvement. And I'm going to be completely blatant. My mission here is to accumulate as much evidence to get EMS systems to realize that lift assist is a patient that requires a good clinical assessment. Because there's lots of systems who don't even record these, right? Like they send somebody, they pick them up. There isn't even an EPCR. They're like this missing gap in the system. And there's lots of people who see these patients as burdens. So I wanted to like myth bust a lot about what this population is. And so the tight timeline was important because I think it's hard to say that when I'm back a day later all the time, 10% of the time, that that's just, the comorbidities of this population.
No, I love that. And so another thing that I found really interesting about your paper was there are so many different ways to define geriatric patients, from 55 to 65 and all over the board. And for your paper, you went with 60. And can you talk to us a little bit about that decision making?
Yeah, so this was right, the 55 comes from the trauma data where it says you're more like, and I think lots of people think of these as trauma patients, where when you're thinking about the increase in mortality cutoffs, 65 comes from Medicare and like the age of retirement. But I wanted to inclusively capture the population of lift assist in our region. And so what I did is I took a year of data of all our lift assist calls and I plotted them by age. And really the cutoff, there's a big steep cutoff where we're going to catch more than 90% of those patients. Because occasionally there's like a 37-year-old who falls down in their ankle and somehow that gets charted as a lift assist. And like, that's not what I'm looking at, right? Um, there was a cutoff at 60 where there was a clear change in the axis of the curve, and then greater than 90% of our lift assist patients were 60 and over. And I would miss about 5 to 10%. I don't remember the exact thing. If it's a supplemental figure, I would actually miss a good chunk of these patients if I did the cutoff at 65. And 55 was a difference. So I used our data to say, what's the population? Because this is a local, this is a single center study of what is our local population and how am I going to capture the patients that I'm specifically trying to look at from a quality perspective. But for us, it was 60. And I've replicated that like year after year. It's one of the things that I look at, I can pull. And the cutoff is 60 in our region. And maybe that's just, Rochester, New York. But I encourage people to actually look at this distribution in their own system to say, like, what are the population that we serve? And when you're locally looking at your performance, what should the cutoff locally be so that you're actually capturing the people you're taking care of in your system who are calling for this particular service? But yes, that was something that came up with the reviewers. The reviewers are like, because I had done it so long ago, I didn't even think to include it in the methods. And they're like, where'd you come up with 60? And I'm like, there was a method to the madness. That was the method to the madness. As once upon a time I looked at this, so I included it as a supplemental figure.
No, I love it. That's great. And what a great idea to use data, right, to drive your decisions for future research. I think that is an excellent choice on your part and the rest of your co-authors. One more thing I want to ask you before I open this up to our other panelists. You did look at data from electronic health records and you did some manual chart reviews, and a lot of our audience are kind of budding researchers, new paramedics who want to get into research. And I like to always talk about it's not always perfect, right? Some of the challenges you had in getting the data that you really would have liked to analyze. So can you talk to us about some of those challenges?
Yeah, I think that there's always like, what's the ideal data set that I would like to have to answer this question? And I can describe my dream data set. My dream data set is complete. It contains all the dispatch information. It electronically pulls all this information. It reads the narrative for me and tells me whether or not they were walked because it was a nemesis element. And that assessment is something that's standardized. So when I say they were walked or not walked, it means the same thing in every chart. And I have access to health data information exchange. So I actually have the outcomes in the hospital of whether or not that patient died and what their diagnosis was and all those interventions. Like that's the ideal data set. And then what I had was nothing close to that, right? Like the way I could pull this particular repeat I'm going to put out there, like, you don't have to be a computer genius to do this stuff. And sometimes you can just like brutane collect data manually. As much as I like insult Rem, sometimes I tell Remley what I've done, and she's like, "Oh, I can't believe that. That's so painful." But sometimes, if you want the answer, and that data doesn't exist, and you want the answer now, you just go ahead and do it. So, we had the repeat patients report and I could see the impression, and that's why our data extraction is kind of weird, right? Like we start off with all the repeat patients and then we cleaned it up to where the primary impression was lift assist. And then we as in Heather Allen, who's a paramedic who I worked with, who's phenomenal and author on this paper, like manually went through those charts and read them and said, like, was this patient walk? Like, were these vital signs? And then we mapped all of those. And when it came to saying that repeat encounter and the grouping, like, was this patient transported or not, or was this a medical diagnosis or not, I'm left with the EMS clinical impression of, was it a medical kind of thing? Did they think that they were infected or a stroke or respiratory distress, or were they injured in some other way? I don't have the outcomes data for that. That is a big weakness and limitation of this paper. The only thing I know is that from the ones that I'm able to follow up from a quality improvement perspective, that EMS clinicians are actually, when they think it's a medical problem, they're pretty darn right most of the time, that it's a medical problem. And so I think we're able to classify those. But Yeah, this data set was like far from the dream data set that I would want to answer this question. But I think that there's still value in doing initial research that helps you get at that question, and sometimes inspires like the better data sets, and thinking like, if I can inspire Remley Crowe to use the ESO data set in a similar way to answer this question, I think that's worth it.
No pressure.
No pressure. Or I can just show up at a meeting and say, I am Dr. Crowe. Yes, we look alike. I'm wearing pink shoes. Like, we are going to do this thing.
Probably enough credentials to make it happen.
Well, I often, actually every month, have the unenviable task of holding folks up from getting to your fantastic and interesting results as we talk about methods. But before we get to your results, I want to open this up to some of our other panelists to see if they have any other methods related questions. And I just want to thank you because I think this is a really important addition to literature. So thank you for doing this. And it was, I hope that everyone listening to this actually gets to read the manuscript because it's well worth it.
First off, want to thank you again to Dr. Dorsett that this is super thoughtful work, and we could see that you put a lot of effort into this, you and your team, just carefully thinking about how to do this study and how to use the data that you have with its limitations to show some, what we'll see, really interesting results. Just wanted to know a little bit more about the context before we look at the results. And I understand New York State, I believe, has kind of common state protocols, and then within your region, you might have additional protocols or guidance. I was wondering if you could share with our listeners a little bit more about whether there might be a specific protocol or checklist or guidance a lot for these falls or lift assists, and how that could potentially change how we think about the results or help guide us.
I think that's a really good question, and it's a temporally dynamic answer. So, as a background, New York State has statewide collaborative protocols at both the BLS and the ALS level, but there isn't a geriatric fall protocol, right? That says this, or a lift assist protocol. And I think mostly because that's the patient assessment protocol, like, or the patient refusal policy. But I think our region at this point, and this data, I've been doing quality improvement around this for a while, but this data you'll notice is like 2021, 2022 was the data, like our baseline data actually right before we took off and did a bunch of quality improvement work. So this is where we were actually before we did that, where we developed regional policies and improvement components. The one thing that did exist that I think makes it so that our regional performance is actually higher than national performance on things like vital signs. You'll see like 85% of the time vital signs were obtained, a full set of vital signs was obtained here, which we recently published a paper with lead author Alyssa Green, work we did on NEMSQA, that showed that actually that's about 35% higher than the national average for this particular patient population. So we were actually doing better than average, but like better than average, I think, is not what we aspire to in quality improvement. It's excellence. So we had that as and I think part of the reason that we had higher performance than that is that our region, not the state, had a definition of a patient for the region that was part of our refusal policy. And that definition of a patient was basically like, anytime you're called to help somebody and the object of that is the person, there's much better language for that is actually a patient, which would make all geriatric fall patients a patient. And part of that policy is that you need to be assessing these patients. So unlike other regions that are like have policies that you don't assess these patients, our region had a policy that these are patient, they met the definition of the patient and need to be assessed. And so that was work done by Jeremy Cushman and Ben Sensabach, who I can tell is here because he left a comment on our leftist impression in our region before I even came to the region. So I got to like inherit, I think, a very good setup from that. Since then, as part of this work, we've done regional quality improvement around improving patient assessment and developed a quality of care bundle around geriatric falls. And we've improved, for example, that ambulation number, which was 41% in this paper. For the agencies that we track it in, we are over 90% of those patients being ambulated before we leave their house. So I don't know if I would get the exact same numbers now if I did the study, just because our performance on those things is different. I can tell you the repeat patient number is something that's very hard to budge. Like I can think that I've improved it for a while and then it climbs back up. And I hope we get to discuss what is going to be the complexity of changing that outcome, but why I think it's so important that you measure it.
That's really good context. Thanks for sharing that. And I was also impressed by the vital signs documentation piece too, that just that alone kind of tells a whole story in and of itself. So thank you.
Absolutely. And so I think it's time for us to dive into the results. And as framing for the results, nothing more, I want to take a look at figure 1 in the paper. So this figure nicely lays out that inclusion and exclusion. And Maya already talked a little bit about some of those challenges with, first of all, identifying repeat patients when EMS data historically has been episodic. That's how it was designed. That's how the system was designed to give us episodes of care. But being able to find repeat patients in and of itself ultimately left this group with a cohort of over 400 unique patients to examine. And so with these 400 unique patients, there were over 1,000 encounters. So repeat visits already, just right off the bat, is a thing. And the study can progress on to study, well, what were the characteristics of these patients? And so I want to go ahead to table 1, where I do have my first set of questions. And you sort of touched on this already. But on table 1, which is for those who aren't able to see the video, is vital sign and ambulation assessment on the index encounter. You mentioned that the ambulation assessments here at the baseline was relatively low for your expectations, but I don't know, at least when I was in EMT school, that the importance of an ambulation assessment or even how to do it was really emphasized. So I would love if you talk a little bit about what do we mean when we say ambulation assessment? Why is it important? And maybe you can give some tips that you've learned from your quality improvement work on how that was increased among your clinicians in their assessments.
Yeah, and I think giving a little bit of background about what is an ambulation assessment and what is the purpose of it. And my background coming from emergency medicine is we used to call this, we call this the road test in the emergency department, right? And if you're learned very early on in emergency medicine, if somebody can normally walk with something normally, and then they're in your emergency department and they can't walk, you can't send them home. But all the time I realized that we weren't assessing patients to be able to do this within the context of EMS. The purpose of an ambulation assessment is not just a safety assessment. It's actually a medical assessment. And I like to give the example of one of all the reasons that somebody can be on the floor, right? Like I could have a posterior circulation stroke, which means I'm okay when I'm like sitting here, or I might complain of feeling a little bit dizzy, but that I can't actually get up and walk. If there was the Dorset pre-hospital assessment for sepsis in older adults, it would be if somebody uttered the words like, I was walking with my walker to the refrigerator and my legs felt really heavy and I felt weak and I just like went to the ground. And if you think about like we do ambulatory pulse oxes in patients with CHF all the time, because walking, just the idea of like walking to the refrigerator, you might desat and feel weak and go down. Or if you're poorly perfused, because you have sepsis or infection, you might feel weak and go down. So is it testing their ability to do that is both a safety assessment to make sure that when you leave this person, they're able to make it to the refrigerator, they're able to make it to the bathroom and not have a recurrent fall, but it's also a medical assessment for things like perfusion and, like perfusion, the lack of hypoxia with ambulation, ACS, it's like a very big component. And I think one of the big things that has happened in EMS is that things are kind of misappropriated from one pathology to the other, right? You learn like you never walk your heart attack down the stairs and you're like, duh. But then it gets into like you're never walking people. But walking people is a really important assessment that I think is not standardly taught. But when you say like, how do you teach this? I've also learned like I was like, how do you properly do an ambulation assessment? Like I know what I've done, but it's not the proper way to do it. In our region, we worked with a physical therapist whose job is to evaluate people and interviewed her on what is your thought process? How do you evaluate? And we took tools that they built to build into an ambulation assessment that basically starts with one, is the person able to actually independently get up from sitting to standing and where you're leaving them, because we're always trying to be kind and help them up, but that doesn't mean they can get out of the recliner when we leave. Checking their gait and looking for things like, can they dual task when they're ambulating? Like they can answer a question and walk, because that's a fall risk thing, but also if they're doing 100% of their focused attention, making sure that they're not falling down, and how far can they walk. So we've built that as like a standard ambulation assessment and education around that. And we've really improved that number over time.
I think that is one of the key messages in the study, at least one of my key takeaways is this type of assessment, and I'm old, I get that, wasn't necessarily taught to me in my program, but I think that it is a really key indicator of a person's health and of what may happen after we're not available. I do want to look also at table 2, which looks at the timeline of repeat encounters. So we talked already in table 1 about vital signs assessment and how often those were being captured and higher than the national average, that abyss of mediocrity not being a place we want to hang out though. But moving into the actual timeline. So Tony, had asked about the 14 days, the 7 days, the 30 days. But here you actually found that the median time was much less for a repeat encounter, typically about a day, and the vast majority, if not within a day, within 72 hours. I'm curious your thoughts on, were you surprised at how quickly these repeat encounters happen? Why or why not?
I was not surprised because I'd been looking at this data in a different context for a while from quality improvement stuff, but I think a lot of people are surprised.
Mhm.
I think that this timeline is important for a few reasons. One is to kind of myth bust some of the perception of the lift assist patient. When people are asked to describe who this patient is, right, and they picture it, the story I get is about that like one person who calls EMS all the time over and over and over and over again. And the idea is that there's very few patients who are using a lot of resources. That is the person that we remember in our EMS system. And the change theory of how we change that to happen is very different than if we think about the population. And I think that's the importance of research, looking at all the data to say, how do we describe this population? I think the biggest thing is that we realize that like there was one person in this entire data set who was called, who we saw 6 times in that week. But the vast majority of patients we saw one more time, and then the majority of that time they went to the hospital that time, which suggests like maybe they should have gone to the hospital the first time. Not necessarily, I can't tell that. That's retrospective data. But I think the median being 1 day and that 75% it's within 3 days, I think lends evidence that is totally just association, but lends evidence that there is potentially an opportunity to change the care on that first encounter to change these outcomes of repeat transport, and that it's a tight time window. And so when these studies are looking at 14-day and 30-day outcomes, like it's actually, you can go much more narrower in this population if you want to specifically be looking at like our episode of care and our assessment as an opportunity.
Absolutely. And I think that finding in and of itself was so key. And for me, it was surprising because I would have bet money the other way, that it would be a longer fallout and that there's just bad luck or a series of unfortunate events, tripped over the dog 14 days later. But these data tell a very different story, and that there is that potential for an intervention window. And now I am going to invite the other panelists to come ask questions because I know that the time flies by, but I'll ask one more while they pop on. This is a word that I hate, and those who know me or have ever been subject to me as reviewer number 2 know that I hate this word, and the word's refusal. But in your narrative reviews, you saw that a lot of the patients who had abnormal vitals refused transport. And I'm curious, and people can decline a transport. I totally believe in that. I just think we overuse the word refusal, is my pet peeve there. But I am curious, how does a patient declining something, and these patients have real fear of going to the hospital and not coming home, so I totally get it. But how do we bring in thoughts about patient autonomy versus clinician concern and therapeutic communication? What did this teach us?
I think that I'm so glad you asked this question, because I think this is one case where what's documented in the chart is so different, not different than what's in reality, but the reality is so variable because one of the areas I really, want to do the research on is like, what is it, by asking patients, not what we think is important, but asking this patient population, what is important to you? What is the information that makes a difference in your ability to make this decision? Because very often it's like, do you want to go to the hospital? And the patient says no, and that's a refusal.
Yep.
But if I have taken the time, and that's not a refute. I mean, that's a decline of transport given what I've offered. But it's the same thing actually with vital signs, where people are like, they refused vital signs. And the question is like, how is it presented to them? Because a lot of things like that people say they refuse, but did you therapeutically communicate? There's a lot of reasons that you could have ended up on the floor. It's just important to me that we check this out. We get an initial set of things so that we can talk about it, make sure that everything's okay. A lot of times if you communicate like that with patients, I never had a patient refuse vital signs. I used to go to all the lift assists when I was an EMS fellow. So it's how you present it. The same thing around refusal, which is, are you specific about the concerns? One of the things that was interesting in that narrative review is I looked at, did they make note of discussing the abnormal vital sign? Because I specifically looked at people with abnormal vital signs with the patient. And tachycardia was never noted as something that was specific and discussed. Like a heart rate over 100 is really abnormal in
Especially
a over 60-year-old, especially a bunch of people. It's an abnormal finding. It's one of the first things that you can know is like, oh, maybe you're, like maybe you're septic or something. And so I found that when you take the time to do a thorough patient assessment, when you can discuss the specific risks, right? Not like seizure, coma, death, sign here, but understanding what matters, what their fears are, because there's a lot of fear, legitimate fear of taking these patients to the hospital and saying, I'm specifically concerned that you might have an infection. The issue with infection is the sooner it's treated, the more likely you are to do well. And so, right, there's ways that you can have the anticipatory component. And in the end, patients have autonomy. But when we say you're having shared decision making, really shared decision making is about specificity of what you think is going on. And you can't have specificity of what you think is going on if you don't do a thorough assessment to know what's going on and pick up on those abnormalities. So I think this is the black box of like, what is actually happening? What do these conversations look like? And I think, we'll get to the table where we didn't see a difference between a specific vital sign or an ambulation assessment. One, our sample size is small, but I can tell you, like, I work in an emergency department where I am like the geriatric fall center of excellence, like where they all come and I'll take care of all of them. Like this is the patient population I love taking care of. But like taking a history, therapeutically communicating, understanding goals and values is a huge skill that I don't think is valued generally in EMS because we don't see like the importance of it.
This is exactly where I'd hope that you would take that conversation, because I do think that how something's presented really matters, and that assessment does go beyond just the clinical into what matters to the patient. Like, I know I had a patient once, and this sounds really silly. I wanted her to go to the hospital, and she kept saying no. And you finally, what's going on? What makes you not want to go? Leftover dinner was on the stove. Okay, if I put that in the fridge for you, can we go? And the food will still be here when we get back. And boom, let's go. Okay, but like that was a really simple discovery that just wouldn't have happened without getting to the root of why don't you want to come with me?
Yes, right. Like, and what is it that matters to you, and how can I communicate so that our interests are aligned? I always say, like, if you ever feel like you're sitting across the table from your patient instead of on the same side of the table, then you got to change your approach, because it's not you versus them convincing some stubborn person. It's like working together how to guarantee the best outcome. And this population, I think, is particularly difficult in that you have to be like a little bit more patient. You have to ask questions. You really have to think about that in every patient population, but particularly in this population about goals of care and what matters most. And so that is, I think, so ripe for qualitative research. Quantitative, like there's so much good we could do if we knew the answers and could standardize the process of how that's done.
Absolutely.
Maya, thank you for sharing this. Is amazing research, and so appreciate you spending a little bit of time with us going through it, but mainly the work that went into making this great paper. I have just a couple thoughts that had occurred. One is I think back to what the paramedic education standards require and the number of this many aged patients, this many chief complaint patients, this many procedures. I don't think lift assist actually shows up anywhere in those required patient encounters. It doesn't surprise me that maybe we're not very good at assessing a patient. Certainly there are some refusal requirements, but it makes me think we probably need to design some simulations in our initial education courses so that our students are coming out prepared to do that. But my real question was, did you maybe look at this? Is there anything agency specific, right? Are there some agencies that if we don't do a lot of refusals or lift assists, all of our patients end up going to the hospital, and then some agencies, maybe you're seeing these third and fourth and fifth repeat encounters?
Amongst all the agencies, I'm going to say it affects every single agency. And some have high months and some have low months. I continue to track this for 3 agencies. I look at repeat encounters, ambulation assessment, vital signs for 3 agencies in our region, like every single month. And there's some who seem to have like lower enough, like 1 month versus the other, and it's just common cause variation. It's going up and down over time. I think any agency that is actually capturing that there's an EPCR for that first encounter and looked at their data would find this as a pattern. Like, and I'm not saying that the numbers are going to be exactly the same or the percent repeats going to be the same or the percent assessments going to be the same. But if there's any agency leadership or educators or anything out here, I want to say like if you're thinking, what can I do? How am I going to inspire people to assess these patients? The number one source of inspiration to do a good job here is the data on what happens to the patient. When I put up our local data of these patient outcomes, people are like, oh, because fundamentally, everybody goes to work and says, I want to do a good job by people, right? Like, I want to take good care of people.
Absolutely.
And sometimes they just don't know what they don't know because the culture is that they've been told that this is a lift assist. You know, I have a lot of imposter syndrome about never being an EMT or a paramedic, but I think this is one case where it like worked out because I didn't grow up in this culture because I don't necessarily think I would have thought to question it. But I came in like horizontally into EMS and I arrived on my scene and my mentor Sabina Braithwaite was like, I want you to go to these scenes and like think about, and I was like, what is happening here? Like, and then I thought about a system level of like, is this happening all the time? Like, what is the opportunity to do good? And it is huge. There is so much opportunity to do good.
It goes to my question. I am sure we see it on, and I'm sure everybody each agency has it, but the Maya Dorset specific agencies probably do this better than others. I always like to look at that and say then like, okay, what are you doing differently that we can extrapolate out? And you've shared some of those things, and I'm sure you'll share a few more. But that's always my wonder is like, okay, what are the agencies that are doing it right doing? But we have to find those agencies first. So thank you.
Yeah, it starts with defining them as patients.
Absolutely. I see Bill Toon has his hand up.
Hi there, and thank you for this presentation and this information. I know that one of the challenges with the definition of a patient and the design of the system, does the system allow the providers to acknowledge that people are patients? You know, and we used to get into this debate a lot when I worked for a county service, because it says, what do we do when we come to a car accident and there's 10 people there and a lot of them are walking around and there is physical damage to the vehicles and maybe someone is really sick? How do you account for all the people is what they would often say when we were trying to define what a patient was. So how did you reach some of that buy-in from the providers, other than it just saying from on top down, this is what a patient is?
I think you can never say something from just on top down. So like our definition of a patient was something that was passed as part of a regional policy that goes through our regional REMAC and has a public comment period, stakeholder engagement, and is actually passed by leadership and within our region. Ben Sensenbach, who's our program agency administrator, one of my colleagues, just put our definition of a patient in it, and you can see that it's super broad. I can say this is like an evolving thing. If I looked at my own EMS agency and I said, I looked at all the call canceled on scene. That's where you find the misclassification of a patient. And if you look at your call canceled on scene and looked at the narratives and said, were some of these actually patients and they were not charted that way? I found that like 15% of the time we were charting things as call canceled on scene that were a patient. And a lot of these things are like the MVC type cases. But I think that the key is that you have a broad definition, but you have to start looking at the data. You can look at your call canceled on scenes and say, like, what is actually written there. But the way that you get engagement in people, I think a lot has to do with the approach. Sometimes we approach like, you must do this because obviously you're lazy and you don't want to do this. So I'm going to put this in a policy and just like spank you when you don't do that. And that will get you nowhere. That will get you people like writing things in charts because they're trying to fill the box. I think if you approach people with the problem that you're trying to solve, which is we have older patients where we're missing like sepsis and stroke, and they're not getting to come back home to their lives. They're going to rehab or they're dying in the hospital. How do we change that? Like how do we design a system together to make that better? We have something called the MEMA assessment that we've implemented, which is like Remley has one of our MEMA cards. A lot of the things that have made things better in my system, they did not come from me. I was the cheerleader, but the solutions come from the people who are doing the work. But leadership has to give people the benefit of the doubt that they go to work every day trying to take good care of people, right? Like the worst words in emergency services, or hey, that patient you took care of. Right? Like we saw them back and we ran a cardiac arrest at that house, or you recognize, right, the same dispatch location and it's some bad call and you just pick grandma off the floor the day before. Like that's a terrible feeling that I think we've all experienced because we want to take good care of people. So that's the thing is like people want to know like how to spank people better. That's not what it's around. It's about like how do you engage them in taking better care of patients? Like what does the system need? What can we provide to support them in doing that? And sometimes it's the tools and the resources and the education and continued data and feedback about how they're doing.
I thank you. The one other thing I want to add is, and Michael touched on it, not only do we need to have scenarios that discuss lift assist or patients like it, I often think that sometimes during the clinical time, particularly in the emergency department, I think it's an excellent opportunity for EMS providers to learn how patient discharge is done and some of those subtle tests, because sometimes I found my students in the past were focused on just doing clinical skills and seeing the sick patients that got admitted, that they never learned the subtleties of what it was to discharge someone home or make that decision that this person was safe enough to go home. Mm-hmm. And I think there's some role for that within our education. I think a lot can be handled how we educate our providers.
Yeah, I think some of the valuable time is my students spend time doing shifts with ED attendings, including me. And I think paying attention to one, like how is a thorough patient assessment done? Like I think people think about, quick PQRST, and really it's like ask an open-ended question and be quiet and let people talk. And they will give you the information that you have and what that assessment looks like of before anybody goes home. I had a student with me once recently, and like every shift, the final diagnosis was made by walking the patient, the disposition, right? Like, and I caught things that I'd missed on my initial assessment because I got them out of bed and tried to walk them. And I think it was a key learning experience that sometimes the decision is not a lab value or a test or a procedure. 95% of my clinical decisions around disposition are made by talking to and examining my patients.
Yeah, speaking of clinical decision making, really good points, since that's something that's just super subtle and kind of difficult to protocolize, but was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about shared decision making. And I definitely love how this wasn't just purely quantitative. You also read through the narratives and saw that there was documentation in all of them of decision making. So awesome job with your training.
You can thank reviewer number 2 for that.
Well, I guess, yeah, reviewer number two, sometimes they do have things that they add, but no, this was definitely an excellent study and showed that the highlights of your system really succeeding there. If you could just talk briefly about the role of medical direction, online medical direction, or maybe a supervisor who's called, who's not on scene, to help with these shared decision making in these difficult situations, sort of deciding where to go and to go or to stay.
Yeah, I think this is one case where sometimes actually just calling, I don't know if calling the regular like med consult or med control line is useful, where you get like some random ED doc or provider who's answering that, especially if you think about what's important to these populations. Sometimes calling their primary or calling their sister or calling their neighbor is actually the thing that you need to convince somebody to go to the hospital. But if we think about what is shared decision making and what are the key components of making a decision to stay or go, and we can acknowledge that in this population the answer is not always go, right? Like there's a lot of harm for an unnecessary transport of a frail older person to an emergency department, where most EDs, they're going to end up in the hallway, potentially stuck there overnight, catching something else, developing delirium. Like there's harm to unnecessary transport. If I think what the steps are, one is I have to have a thorough assessment. I have to have a concern about what might be going on. And maybe that concern is like, I don't know what's going on, but like you're definitely not safe to stay here, right? Like you were just like, you can't make it to the refrigerator or the bathroom, or you're gonna fall again, or you don't have those resources, or it can be a medical diagnosis. And then that person has to have the decision-making capacity to participate in that conversation. And shared decision-making is about those ingredients, but being able to present the benefits and harms of a particular treatment, in this case, transport, to a patient based on what they value most. So like, as Remley said, part of that key assessment is what is it that matters to that patient, right? A lot of these, like sometimes it's like, if this is a hospice patient and they're septic, like we don't need to take them, right? Like I can think about what values most. The answer is not always like do all the things. So I think like those are the key ingredients of a shared decision-making conversation. And I think that those are not always present. It takes a lot of time and patience to get there. But I think it's well worth it, because I think that the problem is, right, like everybody gets excited for the cardiac arrest that they get dispatched, or the bad respiratory distress, or the hypotensive patient they got to start levo on. But I think the most exciting thing is actually if you catch it when it's early sepsis, or it's mild CHF, or they caught their syncope due to heart block. And then and that's the uneventful case, right? Like I catch the subtle presentation, I take them to the hospital, they get early treatment, and they don't end up in shock or respiratory failure or cardiac arrest. And I think it's like thinking about how do we make upstream sexy? You know, how do we make subtle presentations of disease, the good catches of EMS? And that is a paradigm shift, where you fundamentally have to tap into people's value systems. How do you make the goals of care conversation one of the most valuable things that you feel good about? And like it's doable. I mean, that's the trajectory. I started out working in a big, busy trauma center. I work now at a ED that specializes in taking geriatric patients. Like I love my job. And those kinds of things make me feel really good at the end of the day when I go home. But that's not like, that took a long time to accept that that's actually what I do.
I think that's a really key
Really
point, is
insightful.
building it into our culture. And now I have the unpopular task of wrapping us up, because we are the hour flies by, especially with such an interesting topic. And there has been a lot of fantastic discussion amongst the participants. And I do want to highlight one comment around the MEMA card. Is there a location where our viewers can access the MEMA card, or can we circulate a copy of it in the show notes perhaps?
Yes.
It really is an
I
interesting.
can, what I can do is I can send you like the PowerPoint slide that has
Perfect.
the MEMA card, and then you can add it to the show notes. And I got to give credit, David DeCanzio, who's a paramedic in our system, came up with the MEMA mnemonic as part of a contest we had on geriatric assessment. So MEMA was not my innovation. I just made it rainbow and put it on a card.
And without doing a spoiler alert, the W in MEMONT does stand for walk,
Walk.
the ambulation assessment. But yes, we will get a copy of that added to the show notes. And thank you to both you and the developer of the tool. And I do like to let the author have the last word. So we talked about your commitment to improvement science and system level interventions. What better project than here to talk about that? So as our last question, if an EMS system hears this and wants to reduce potential misdiagnoses in lift assists, in the air quotes still, what's the first step you'd recommend?
I haven't solved that problem yet. I think I'm getting close. I think the first thing I do is look at your data and review those charts and say, am I walking people? Am I assessing people? What's the quality of assessment? And then focus on improving the quality of the patient assessment. I do think looking at 72-hour outcomes, and now we have data to support that, it wasn't like something I made up, is a useful thing, because when it comes to getting people inspired to make a difference and engage, those 72-hour repeats is something that speaks the language of we don't want that. Like, we want to do a good job and take care of our patient the first time.
I think that's fantastic advice. And I do want to thank you again for taking on the pain of this work. Maya does have a high threshold for pain when it comes to data sets. And so greatly value that for this wonderful paper that was created from such a labor of love. And thank you for taking the time to share your experience with this audience. I know there will be great dialogue that continues well after this podcast. But I will take us out of here now. And I do want to thank the audience for tuning in live today. For those of you who are used to being on this podcast, you'll know. For those of you who are new, welcome. There is an Education Research Journal Club podcast later this month, Friday, August 22nd. And as always, we'll be back here with the clinical podcast, second Monday of the month, which will be September 8th. Thank you all for listening. And thanks again to the authors of this wonderful paper. And we'll look forward to nerding out with you all next time.
We hope you have enjoyed and learned from this PCRF Journal Club. Please share it with other interested EMS professionals. An archive of past journal clubs can be found at pcrfpodcasts.org. You can also find us on Facebook at PCRF at UCLA and on our website, prehospitalcare.org. A special thank you to our sponsors, Limmer Education, providing educational tools for success at every stage of your EMS journey, and ESO, dedicated to improving community health and safety through the power of data.